Hello and welcome to week 7. This week we are going to be talking about taking action and forming strategic alliances. We're going to talk about the anti-poverty movement. We'll talk about people who are unhoused and also about forming alliances. So the anti-poverty movement is so much bigger than the issue of homelessness, and it incorporates many, many different things. So it's a larger group of campaigns that are actually connected to supporting anti-poverty actions. And that could be anywhere from activism to advocacy, and happening at a variety of different levels as well. Some examples would be one of the things that we talked about in week 4, which was Occupy Wall Street. The fight for $15 around the minimum wage, paid sick leave for all workers, something that's been really prominent in the last number of years, particularly around COVID and the inequity that exists, particularly with people in precarious work or in lower income brackets, and their lack of access to sick time. Defund the police is part of an anti-poverty movement, as is the prison abolition movement, and the intersections of income and access to resources position all of these different movements within the anti-poverty movement. So the first group that we're going to talk about, and our focus for this week also of guest speakers, is people who are unhoused, which absolutely intersect with a wide variety of different groups of people who are systemically excluded. So people who are unhoused, who are they? Well, there's no such thing as a typical homeless person. The population is incredibly diverse, and no one is absolutely safe from experiencing homelessness. It can exist in urban and rural settings, though often it is much more apparent in urban settings. It can also be invisible. So many people who are homeless don't actually live on the streets. There are things like, if you've heard the term couch surfing. So couch surfing is, just like it sounds, going from couch to couch to couch, because you don't have stability that allows you to have housing. And so you're relying on your connections to be housed. And there are a lot of intersecting vulnerabilities and overrepresentation of the working poor, single parents, seniors, women experiencing violence, racialized people, including Indigenous people, and you'll hear a lot about that, particularly in the conversation around encampments and people who are unhoused in Prince George, BC, LGBTQ plus youth, persons with disabilities, including those who are actually experiencing mental health issues. Addictions is another area of intersection as well. So where exactly did the homeless emerge from? So the definition of homelessness is that it's an extreme form of poverty that's characterized by the instability of housing and the inadequacy of income, and of healthcare supports and social supports. And it's really grown into a big problem in Canada in the past 30 years, as we've actually reduced access to affordable housing and to different social supports. So we have this, Canada has what we call a welfare state, and that welfare state has shrunken significantly and shrinks every time a new government comes into power. It's very rare that you actually have the restoration for very long anyway of different social supports. I'm going to play, I haven't done this before, but I'm going to play a short video for you that emerged as a YouTube channel in Hamilton, and from a man who shares his perspective on being unhoused and his firsthand experience. And what's interesting about this, from this article, and I've included the article on the setting context piece, and he actually uses a cell phone to do his filming, and then he actually uses the library, or just before COVID hit, he was able to use the library on a regular basis to actually process his videos as well. So I'm going to play a small piece for you by Penny O'Radical, which is his screen name. And just one moment. Okay.
Welcome back to the channel, everybody. Well, winter's finally here. Personally, I've always loved winter. Are you nuts? Why do I like winter? Well, it's a challenge. It's exciting. It's different. It shakes us out of our routine and brings us together. So with the winter weather, things get a little more difficult for homeless people. Like I said, I've always loved winter, but that was mainly because I had a warm place to go back to and dry off. I always loved going out walking after winter storms, but it's not quite as enjoyable when you have no place to go. So now that winter's here, I've been thinking a lot about the best way to help homeless people, the best way to help a homeless person. As an individual, you yourself, I'm not talking about institutions or politics or policies. I'm just talking about you as an individual. What's the best way to help a homeless person day in and day out? The answer is treat them like a human being. The only thing you personally can do, because they are human beings. Everybody has a story. Nobody wanted to be homeless. And when I say treat them as a human being, I mean, it goes both ways. Don't treat them special. Don't give them extra. Just give them as much as you would give another human being. You shouldn't bend the rules for them. You shouldn't, treat them like they're any different than anyone else. That's the only way to give people confidence and make them feel like they're a part of society, like they're a citizen. And it leads by example. It's really all you can do. Be a good person yourself. Other people will see that and want to live up to it. Well, there you go. That's the best way, I think, you can help homeless people. So thanks for watching. It really means a lot to me. Thanks everybody for engaging. See you in the next one.
So I wanted to share that piece with you because I think it's helpful to hear from someone who has lived experience as someone who's unhoused or homeless. Penny O'Radical actually has a whole YouTube channel. So if you're interested in looking at more of his short little videos, I really encourage you to do that. A couple of years ago, one of my students actually contacted him through his YouTube channel and met up with him and had coffee at a Tim Hortons and talked with him about his experience because he had opened himself up to having a conversation. And and then did her project based on people who are unhoused, with his feedback. So just to give you an idea, I'm not advocating that you should go out for your projects and look for someone who is homeless, but this was an example of someone who had invited conversation, and she started a conversation online, and then connected with him. She lived in his neighborhood in Hamilton. So we're going to talk about you've heard a lot probably in the news about tent cities or encampments. Tent cities was what for the last 20 years temporary housing communities were called. It was temporary housing that was set up informally by people who were homeless, unhoused, or their allies, generally self-regulated and not sanctioned by the governments. And the homes were comprised of a variety of materials: tents, lean-tos, cabins, sometimes prefab houses, campers, recycled materials. They could have access to some kind of infrastructure or amenities, and could also be but in any case, they are a symbol of the government's inability to provide safe and accessible housing. Kathy Crow talked about in the articles that you read this week about different tent cities and some of the activism around tent cities. Here are just some examples of what tent cities across Canada can look like. So you see a tent city, built of cardboard right by the street, to something that is much more permanent and is built of wood and obviously has a high level of organization. And you can see a propane tank in the corner. Can be in more rural settings as well, or in this case, by train tracks as well. So, I mean, there are such a wide variety of different tent cities or encampments that exist. There is a significant history of tent cities in North America. They've actually been in existence for several decades. And at the corner here is my dog trying to get my attention. So that is where my arm is going right now to keep her quiet. So there was a real prominence at the turn of the millennium at a time when the huge disparities between rich and poor became more evident. And so you see alongside large buildings, temporary but quite permanent looking structures were functioned as communities for people in cities. There were an increase of tent cities and encampments for a number of reasons. We talked about the increase of people who are unhoused due to that shrinking welfare state, but then access to social services. So lack of availability in shelter space, and governments that fail to address the underlying root of homelessness, and inadequacies of the shelter system. This is a picture that was taken within the shelter system, and just to show what it looks like inside a shelter by someone who is using the shelter services. So there's often a lack of safety or community because you're constantly having to pack up during the day within the shelter system. They can really hamper an ability to seek employment and an inability to tend to activities of daily living, because you're having to pick up everything you own and take it with you during the day, and then line up so that you can get a space in a shelter, because there aren't enough spaces in shelters. And there's been a lot in the news about the lack of shelter systems, but also the conversation around the fact that shelters don't actually provide a solution. It's providing a Band-Aid. Um, Another issue around people with addictions is that people with addictions are not welcome. And so they're excluded from even using shelter systems. And health concerns in terms of things that are very easily carried between people, especially when you're in a very condensed spaces. So lice, Bartonella, tuberculosis, hepatitis A and C, HIV, and during COVID, COVID has been a big issue as well. There have been a number of political issues that surround tent cities or in encampments. So I gave 3 case studies in the setting the context for this week. And so one is Hamilton, one is Toronto, and one is Prince George, BC. And a number of the responses to by government, by individuals, to different encampments. There is really a government focus on making housing issues and homelessness invisible to the public. And when there are encampments or tent cities that are set up, that those issues are no longer invisible. They're very public and very visible. Maddie doesn't think that's good. That's good either. So that's why she was just poking me in the arm. There's also a lack of political will to devote adequate resources to supporting temporary housing solutions. And then you have residents of communities that are often more interested in abolishing tent cities or encampments through kind of not in my backyard, so NIMBYism. And private funding of political parties from industry is not in favor of tent cities. So these are a number of the political issues, and encampments are not a solution, but they are a solution that is in the control of people who find themselves unhoused. But there are more permanent options that are necessary to respond to the issue of people who are unhoused. There is real value to residents in establishing encampments or tent cities. It's a common denominator, and it becomes a means of self-help and having control over where you live for people who are homeless. They no longer are homeless. It adds value to survival, shelter, a sense of home and safety and personal health, and a sense of community that's really important as well. Who lives in tent cities and encampments? And Kathy Crow talks about the fact that the only common thing among homeless people today in Canada is that they've been dehoused. And so people who are homeless, or according to the UN, dehoused people, economic residents, refugees, displaced persons, and there's a disproportionate number of Indigenous peoples and LGBTQ youth. And protesters of issues such as social or economic inequality. And for many, living in a tent city or living in an encampment actually provides safety, stability, and community. There are a number of criticisms of tent cities or encampments, and I tried to actually share a really wide-ranging number of articles to give you a broad perspective of encampments and the resistance to encampments, but also the experiences of people who live in encampments. So one of the criticisms is around health, so lack of running water, substance abuse, and infectious disease, and safety. So theft and property damage, etc., with different crimes, and that's within communities and in surrounding communities. So neighborhoods don't want to have temp cities in their communities, and a fire risk as well. And there is also legality. So the idea that there's a right to adequate housing. So so then why are people living in this housing that's inadequate? But then and there are violations of bylaws as well. And those behaviors of creating tent cities stem from the need to survive. One of the most notable successes in homeless litigation was Victoria versus Adams, which happened in 2009. And the decision actually dealt with a bylaw that prohibited people from creating overnight shelters in public parks. It targeted, it actually technically applied to everyone, but clearly targeted tent cities or encampments of homeless peoples. But the BC Court of Appeal held that the bylaw infringed Section 7 of the Charter because it deprived people of their life and security of the person. They recognized that while governments don't necessarily create the state of homelessness, they can't legislate in a way that actually is indifferent to homeless persons' charter rights. And it also emphasized that just because a case involves publicly owned property, it doesn't make the case about property rights. I wanted to just show you a number of the articles that you read highlighted the stories of a number of people who were part of the original Lakeshore tent city that was on some Home Depot property. And this was just a picture of Kathy and some of the original residents. So moving on to this idea of forming strategic alliances. And one of the things that Kathy Crow talks about around developing strategy is that you need to have community organizing and tactics that actually influence change. So employ what Kathy calls skillful manipulation. So lobbying the government and being informed and producing research. For example, there was a 1992 street health report that caught the attention of the World Health Organization. So making films that include secret video footage of unsafe conditions within shelters. And that was what one of those pictures that I showed on an earlier slide said, and spreading information via media outlets. So being very strategic about media. And we talked about this earlier in the semester, is that it's really important to celebrate the wins. So any win that you have, because when you are pushing up against hegemony, so the hegemonic state, you are going to get pushback. And even if you are organizing in a peaceful way, we talked about the fact that you can be met with violence. And so it's important for your own sense of self and as a movement to celebrate the wins that you have. It does take a village to make change. So there are a number of networks that exist that come together around the issue of homelessness. So the National Housing and Homelessness Network, the Toronto Disaster Relief Committee that Kathy Crow is a part of, the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, Canadian Housing and Renewal Association, Out of the Cold programs to meet immediate needs, Project Warmth, the Homelessness Hub, which brings together academic work and research on homelessness. In addition to things like the Toronto Encampment Support Network, that was very strong for most of COVID and dissolved, but then took another form, as well as the Hamilton Encampment Support Network and Together We Stand, which is in Prince George. So these are grassroots movements that connect to some of those larger networks. So for example, the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness It leads a national movement and a place for people to come together. So it's individuals, organizations, and communities that are working together to end homelessness in Canada. And the vision is that all Canadians have a safe, decent, and affordable home with the support necessary to sustain it. And the mission is to prevent and end homelessness in Canada. And there are many people who work together within that umbrella, working strategically. It's really important in this work to find allies and to build alliances. So the Hamilton Encampment Support Network, and you'll meet Sabrina Dahab and Gashi Issa, who initially became involved with the issue of homelessness in Hamilton, initially through their work with Black Lives Matter, which then connected to the Defund the Hamilton Police Services. And then their call was for defund the Hamilton Police Services by 50% and invest in housing services, and then to actually developing the Hamilton Encampment Support Network. The Toronto Encampment Support Network, which this year, the website and the movement served its purpose because other people took up the work that they were doing. I talked about this in a number of the resources that I shared with you in terms of the Toronto Prisoner Rights organization connected with the Toronto Encampment Support Network and other networks pulled together as well to address the issue of homelessness. And then together we stand in Prince George, working together and making connections between other encampment support networks as well. The Encampment Support Network in Toronto was an ad hoc volunteer-run network that supported people in encampments. There were weekly newsletters, there was a sharing of strategy and a connecting with other networks around racial justice. And there were a lot of, and there's a couple of videos that I included in the setting the context that talked about the artists who during COVID realized that there were people who were homeless, and artists and activists came together and saw something that they could do in this space and place. And that it was through those ad hoc and volunteers that support was given to people who were living in encampments, as well as in the end, last spring and last fall, when there were legislations around taking down, so last April, around taking down all of the encampment support networks, those people also served to protect and try to stop the police intervention within the encampments. The Hamilton Encampment Support Network was actually when Sabrina Dahab and Gashi Issa came to talk with my class last year. They were just in the process of trying to think about how they could actually make the work that they were doing more organized. And so they are also a volunteer-run advocacy network that supports a growing community of homelessness and unhoused people in Hamilton. And they really feel and see the importance of finding allies and working together, because they feel like without that, those most impacted by Hamilton's housing crisis will suffer. Together We Stand is, this is just a picture of a protest that they held outside of City Hall in Prince George. And there's an article you can read there, but a lot of similarities across the country, and dependent on where different where cities or where small cities or towns are held, within some of the articles that you'll read around Prince George is that there are actually about 70% of the people living in encampments are actually Indigenous. And one of the articles that I also included talked about this idea of an attack on encampments being a continuation of the violence of colonialism as well. So all of these things are connected to each other. We're going to continue this conversation in our conversation on February 24th. We're going to have our third guest panel, and joining us will be Gashi Issa, Sabrina Dahav from Defund the Hamilton Police Services and Hamilton Encampment Support Network, and Amelia Merrick, and possibly one other member from Together We Stand in Prince George, who will have to join us at 7 a.m. in the morning. You can find out more about these movements if you're interested. I know that a number of you have spoken to the work that some of these activists are doing, so you're aware of what they're doing. I encourage you to take a look at some of the context setting pieces that I provided, because I think it will prepare you really well for the conversation and to be able to contribute to the conversation around strategy and around the issues facing people who are unhoused across Canada. I wish you a wonderful week and look forward to continuing our conversation.